Oh, I was so jealous. I was jealous of the Beatles. I couldn't believe how jealous I was.
Genius and conflict often go hand in hand. Behind every beautiful melody, there can be a story of incredible pressure, rivalry, and psychological turmoil. And maybe no one in pop music history embodies this paradox more than Brian Wilson, the visionary architect of the Beach Boys sound. This was a man who heard a teenage symphony to God in his head and wrestled it into existence, changing music forever. But that revolution didn't happen in a peaceful vacuum. It happened on a battlefield that in 1966, Brian Wilson was meticulously crafting his masterpiece, the album Smile. He played a complex, beautiful section for his band that was light years ahead of its time. His cousin and bandmate, Mike Love, listened and, with a few cynical words, reportedly asked, "Who's gonna hear this stuff? The ears of a dog?" That one question wasn't just a critique. For a guy as sensitive as Brian, it was a profound blow. It was a moment that crystallized a conflict that would rage for over half a century, complete with screaming matches, fistfights, and multi-million-dollar lawsuits. That historic showdown was just one of many. Brian Wilson's world was a landscape of intense creative and personal rivalries. Now, hate is a strong word, maybe too simple for the complicated feelings of a man like Brian Wilson. But the clashes, the betrayals, the obsessive competitions, and the deep-seated resentments he felt were so powerful they not only shaped his music but also nearly destroyed him. At times, these relationships sure felt like hate. Today, we're counting down the 6 musicians at the center of Brian Wilson's biggest and most consequential conflicts, from his own family to the biggest names in rock and roll. Kicking off our list is maybe the most tragic and complicated conflict of Brian's life, his relationship with his own brother, Dennis Wilson. This wasn't just sibling rivalry. It was a tangled mess of love, jealousy, shared trauma, and creative friction that simmered for years inside the pressure cooker of the band. In the early days, their roles were pretty clear. Brian was the quiet musical mastermind who stayed home from the beach to write about it. Dennis was his complete opposite, the only actual surfer in the Beach Boys, the handsome, rebellious drummer whose lifestyle gave the band its authentic identity. He was the one who told Brian to write a song about surfing in the first place, which basically launched their career. For years, Dennis looked up to his big brother, blown away by Brian's musical talent. Brian, in turn, pushed Dennis to grow as a musician, even giving him homework to arrange and produce his own tracks during the Smile sessions. But as the 60s went on, things started to change. While Brian's creative ambition soared, so did the tensions within the band. Then, as Brian began to withdraw from the world, fighting his own demons, Dennis stepped up. He started writing his own songs, and they were really, really good. He developed a gritty, soulful voice that was a world away from the band's clean harmonies, and his songwriting had a dark, weary vibe. In 1977, he released a solo album, Pacific Ocean Blue, a masterpiece of raw, emotional rock that critics absolutely loved. This is where the conflict really caught fire. Brian, who had always been the undisputed creative heart of the band, reportedly felt threatened. His little brother wasn't just the drummer anymore, he was a respected artist. This creative jealousy added a new, painful layer to their relationship and made Brian feel even more isolated. At the same time, Dennis got more and more frustrated with the band's direction, feeling they weren't supporting his and Brian's artistic instincts. Their shared struggles with addiction made everything worse. Stories from the late 1970s paint a grim picture of 2 brothers trapped in a cycle of substance abuse. There were tales of Dennis bribing a reclusive Brian with drugs and fast food just to get him to a piano to write. It was a destructive, codependent mess. There's even a popular, though unproven, myth that a frustrated Dennis was the one who first leaked tapes of the unreleased Smile album. While there's no real evidence for this, the fact that the story still circulates says a lot about the turmoil in the family. Their conflict was never as public as the war between Brian and Mike Love, but it was just as profound, a brotherly bond stretched to its breaking point by jealousy, addiction, and the immense weight of genius. The conflict between Brian Wilson and Frank Zappa wasn't about personal drama. You won't find stories of them yelling at each other or fighting over studio time. Their rivalry was purely philosophical, a clash between two of the most unconventional musical minds of the 20th century, who stood on opposite sides of a massive artistic canyon. For all his revolutionary innovations, Brian Wilson was a romantic. His life's work was about perfecting pop music, finding the most beautiful chords and earnest melodies to create that teenage symphony to God. He was on a quest for sincerity and innocence. Even his most experimental music was reaching for a state of grace. Frank Zappa, on the other hand, was pop music's resident cynic. With his band, the Mothers of Invention, he didn't try to perfect pop conventions, he wanted to satirize, mock, and completely tear them apart. His music was a brilliant, chaotic mix of complex jazz, avant-garde classical, and scathing lyrics that made fun of everything from hippie culture to consumerism. While Wilson built cathedrals of sound, Zappa was gleefully throwing rocks through the stained-glass windows. This huge difference in their artistic goals created a silent, philosophical feud. Some reports claim Wilson respected Zappa's technical skill but couldn't stand his artistic attitude, allegedly saying he hated his attitude. To Brian, Zappa's work might have felt like a personal insult, a cynical rejection of the very beauty and sincerity he was trying to create. Zappa's music often had an intentional ugliness and snark that was the total opposite of Brian's search for loveliness. Interestingly, both men were working in surprisingly similar ways in the mid-60s. During the time of Smile and Zappa's albums Absolutely Free and Lumpy Gravy, both were creating modular pieces of music, short fragments that could be edited and pieced together. But they were doing it for completely different reasons. Zappa was creating jarring, surreal soundscapes. Wilson was weaving a seamless, dreamlike tapestry of Americana. Zappa did acknowledge Wilson's work, but usually with a musician's analytical eye. He even parroted Beach Boys songs in his own complex work. This suggests he was aware of Wilson and respected his technical skills, but there's little to suggest Zappa cared for the emotional heart of Wilson's music. Ultimately, this rivalry was a battle of ideas. Wilson's heartfelt pop perfectionism versus Zappa's ironic, intellectual deconstruction. It was a silent conflict between two geniuses pulling music in opposite directions. The rivalry between Brian Wilson and John Lennon wasn't so much a direct feud as it was a psychological battle fought mostly inside Brian's head. It was a conflict born from deep admiration and crippling insecurity, all fueled by the massive impact of the Beatles. While Brian often aimed his competitive streak at Paul McCartney, John Lennon represented a different, more intimidating kind of genius that haunted him. When the Beatles exploded in America in 1964, Brian Wilson definitely took notice. He admitted to being jealous of the mania they created. Here was a band that, like the Beach Boys, wrote their own songs and had amazing harmonies, but they had a swagger and an edge that was totally new. At first, this competition was a healthy push for Brian. But as the decade wore on and the Beatles evolved at a shocking speed, the pressure cranked up. For Brian, Paul McCartney was the master of melody, the guy he was in direct competition with. But John Lennon was the band's soul-bearing poet, its intellectual and experimental force. Lennon's lyrics were getting more complex, surreal, and deeply personal. Songs like Tomorrow Never Knows and Strawberry Fields Forever were pushing the boundaries of what a pop song could be. This is where admiration soured into anxiety. Brian reportedly became obsessed with every new Beatles release, picking apart every song. He started to feel that each groundbreaking track from Lennon was a direct challenge aimed at him. Even though the Beatles were publicly praising Pet Sounds, Lennon even called Brian to congratulate him. Brian's fragile psyche and growing paranoia, made worse by drug use, twisted this mutual respect into a high-stakes, one-sided competition. The story of their personal interactions is a bit foggy, clouded by Brian's well-known mental health struggles. Alice Cooper famously told a story about a fragile Brian asking to meet John Lennon at the Grammys. After a polite introduction, Brian walked away, only to come back minutes later and ask to be introduced again, with no memory of the first time. According to Cooper, Lennon was incredibly kind about it. Whether the story is 100% accurate or not, it paints a picture of a man in awe of Lennon but also lost in his own world. In the end, the conflict with John Lennon was an internal one for Brian. Lennon represented the intellectual, avant-garde side of his rivalry with the Beatles. He was the ghost of artistic credibility that Brian was constantly chasing, even as he was competing with McCartney's melodic genius. This creative war on two fronts, fought inside his own mind, ramped up the pressure that would ultimately contribute to the collapse of the Smile Project and his long retreat from the music world. Before Brian Wilson became a studio wizard himself, he was a disciple. And his god was Phil Spector. The conflict between Brian and the legendary producer is a classic tale of idolization turning into an obsessive, all-consuming rivalry. It was a fight to not only match his hero but to ultimately, in his own mind, destroy him. In the early 1960s, Phil Spector turned record production on its head with his Wall of Sound, a dense, orchestral style that made pop singles sound like mini-symphonies. He packed studios with multiples of every instrument, creating a massive, reverberating sound. For Brian Wilson, hearing a Spector production like the Ronettes' Be My Baby was a life-changing moment. He listened to it over and over, dissecting its power. He called it the greatest pop song ever written. This admiration quickly seeped into his own work. You can hear Spector's influence all over early Beach Boys tracks. But Brian wasn't content to just copy him. His competitive nature kicked in. He became obsessed with figuring out how Spector did it, and then, how he could do it better. This led to a period of intense, one-sided rivalry. They would often book the same studios and use the same legendary session musicians, the Wrecking Crew, but would pointedly ignore each other in the hallways. Brian desperately wanted Spector's approval. He wrote the song Don't Worry Baby specifically for Ronnie Spector, but Phil, fiercely territorial, rejected it. In another mortifying incident, Spector allegedly invited Brian to a session only to publicly humiliate him, dismissing his piano playing as subpar. Whether this story is entirely true or just music lore, it shows the power dynamic between the established tyrant genius and the eager apprentice. This perceived rejection only fueled Brian's fire. He started to openly criticize his idol's work, supposedly calling the Wall of Sound all gimmick, no soul. This wasn't just sour grapes, it was Brian defining his own artistic mission. He decided to take Spector's dense sound but inject it with a new kind of emotional vulnerability and harmonic complexity that was all his own. Pet Sounds was the ultimate result of this quest. It had the grandeur of a Spector production but the intimacy of a personal confession. The rivalry with Phil Spector was the foundational conflict of Brian Wilson's career as a producer. He needed to measure himself against the best, learn from him, and ultimately, defeat him. In doing so, he didn't just match Spector's ambition, he expanded what a pop record could be, finally stepping out of the long shadow cast by the Wall of Sound. That if the rivalry with Phil Spector was about production, the one with Paul McCartney was about the very soul of songwriting. This was the heavyweight championship of 1960s pop, two melodic geniuses on opposite sides of the Atlantic, locked in a creative arms race that pushed both to the absolute peak of their powers. It was a relationship built on deep mutual respect that, for the incredibly sensitive Brian Wilson, spiraled into a crushing, obsessive, and ultimately devastating competition. The battle really kicked off in 1965 when the Beatles released Rubber Soul. For Brian Wilson, it was a gauntlet thrown down. He reportedly gathered the Beach Boys and declared he was going to make the greatest rock album ever in response. The result was Pet Sounds, a masterpiece of harmony, arrangement, and melancholy beauty. When a copy was sent to England, it floored the Beatles. Paul McCartney has said many times it's one of his favorite albums ever, and that, God only knows, made him cry the first time he heard it. McCartney took that inspiration back to the studio, determined to top it. The result was Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. And this is where the friendly rivalry turned toxic for Brian. The release of Sgt. Pepper's in June 1967 landed like a bomb. Brian was in the final, agonizing stages of trying to finish his own magnum opus, Smile, a project already falling apart from band disputes and his own fragile mental state. Then he heard Sgt. Pepper's. Legend has it he was driving when A Day in the Life came on the radio. He had to pull over, totally overwhelmed. He turned to a friend and said, "They did it already." In his mind, McCartney hadn't just made a great album, he had beaten him to the finish line. This wasn't the only reason Smile collapsed, but it was a huge psychological blow that contributed to Brian shelving the album and withdrawing from the world. The artistic race he'd been running was, in his mind, decisively lost. Over the years, their personal interactions have been friendly. McCartney has always been gushing in his praise for Brian. But for Brian in the 1960s, the competition was everything. It was a transatlantic chess match where every album was a checkmate. While this rivalry produced some of the most beautiful music of the 20th century, for Brian Wilson, the perceived checkmate from Sgt. Pepper's was a devastating loss that would take him decades to recover from. At the top of our list, it can only be one name, Mike Love. This wasn't just a rivalry, it was a civil war. A 50-year feud between cousins that was fought in the studio, on stage, in the press, and in court. It was a bitter, deeply personal, and philosophical clash that pitted artistic ambition against commercial reality, and it stands as the most significant and damaging conflict of Brian Wilson's life. Mike Love was the frontman, the guy who wrote the lyrics for many of the band's early hits, and the voice of the Beach Boys' commercial side. Brian was the sensitive, reclusive genius pushing the band into uncharted waters. In the beginning, their partnership worked. Brian wrote the music, and Mike wrote the words about surfing, cars, and girls, the California Dream formula that made them superstars. But as Brian's musical vision grew, their paths split into a canyon of resentment. The breaking point was the Pet Sound sessions in 1966. While Brian was in the studio with session musicians crafting his intricate, sad masterpiece, Mike was on tour with the band. When he got back, he did not like what he heard. He famously mocked the new direction, asking who would listen to such downbeat, weird music and arguing that Brian was messing with their successful formula. His infamous "don't F with the formula" mantra became the heart of their dispute. For Love, the Beach Boys were entertainers whose job was to sell records. For Brian, they were artists, and his job was to express the complex music in his head. This creative fight turned into open hostility during the tortured creation of Smile. Love was especially critical of the abstract lyrics Brian's new collaborator, Van Dyke Parks, was writing. He found them pretentious, and his constant criticism created so much friction that Parks eventually quit the project. For Brian, this was an act of creative sabotage, a deep betrayal. The personal animosity got just as ugly. In interviews, Brian was blunt: "I don't like Mike Love at all. I don't like his attitude." Love, in turn, leaned into his role as the pragmatic villain, once saying, "For those who believe that Brian walks on water, I will always be the Antichrist." The war raged on long after the 60s. In the 1990s, Love sued Brian for songwriting credits on 35 songs, arguing he'd been cheated out of royalties for decades. He won a multi-million-dollar settlement. This legal battle cemented their estrangement. Following Brian Wilson's passing in June 2025, Love shared heartfelt tributes, calling Brian his brother in music and acknowledging their complex journey was filled with brilliance, heartbreak, laughter, complexity and most of all, love. He admitted they had ups and downs but said they never stopped loving each other. John Stamos, a close friend, revealed that Love was speechless for hours after he broke the news of his cousin's death. These recent events add a tragic poignancy to their long, troubled history, hinting that underneath the decades of fighting, a family bond, however strained, still remained. Still, the rivalry with Mike Love was the central conflict of Brian's life. Love represented all the outside pressures, commercial, conservative, cynical, that waged war against Brian's fragile, revolutionary art. It was a feud that helped shape, and nearly break, one of music's greatest minds. The stories of these conflicts are messy, with layers of jealousy, admiration, and betrayal. Everyone involved had their own side of the story. Who do you think was Brian Wilson's most significant rival? Was Mike Love just a pragmatic bandleader protecting a brand, or did he really stifle a genius? Let us know what you think in the comments below. And if you enjoy these deep dives into music history, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you don't miss our next story. Brian Wilson's journey is a powerful reminder of the deep connection between genius and conflict. The rivalries he faced weren't just petty fights, they were fundamental battles over the soul of popular music. His clashes with his brother Dennis showed the pain of family rivalry. His philosophical standoff with Frank Zappa highlighted a deep divide in artistic purpose. The psychological pressure from John Lennon and the obsessive competition with Paul McCartney fueled an arms race that gave us some of the most sublime music ever recorded, but at a huge personal cost. And his half-century war with Mike Love became the ultimate struggle between art and commerce. These conflicts were born from Brian's incredible sensitivity, a trait that let him create music of unmatched beauty and emotion, but also left him wide open to criticism and betrayal. He was a man who heard the future but had to fight the present to create it. The pressures he faced from his bandmates, his idols, and his competitors shaped his masterpieces, but they also played a part in his decades-long retreat from the world. In the end, the story of Brian Wilson's rivalries is the story of the steep, and often painful, price of having a singular vision.